The name of the world's best and only consulting detective, Sherlock Holmes, has gone on to represent mystery and intrigue all over the world for generations. But every shining light has a dark, shadowy underbelly. To such a great hero, this shadow would represent the most despicable of criminals. Out of all the clever and sinister adversaries to cross paths with the great detective, none were as equal a match as Professor Moriarty, a name that would come to define evil genius. And that's all because of one villainous scene. Hello everybody, I'm Kate Cass, and today we're going to talk about Sherlock Holmes. I know, totally out of left field for me. When I heard about the One Villainous Scene series originated by Nando Movies, where creators were prompted to talk about a villain from any media, I tried to be different. I tried to branch out into media I love but don't talk about often. I really did. But when I was trying to think of a villain that really makes their mark with one scene, one truly villainous scene, I kept coming back to Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime himself. Also, I understand One Villainous Scene is almost 2 years old at this point, so I don't even know if this is going to make it onto the playlist, but I was going through my drafts and found this script that I started when the project began and just never finished. And considering this year is the 130th anniversary of the original story's publication where Moriarty debuted, and if I'm quick enough on the editing, this video will go up on May the 4th, a date that commemorates that now famous confrontation at the Reichenbach Falls, and absolutely nothing else, I took it as a sign to make this happen. While it would be very fun to look at the many iconic scenes created for Moriarty in adaptations, we're going to focus on the scene from the original short story where the professor debuted, because that one villainous scene is the only scene Moriarty is in. Let's rewind a little. Professor Moriarty was introduced in the 24th short Holmes story, The Final Problem, the story that was famously meant to kill off Sherlock Holmes for good because Conan Doyle was sick of writing about him. Thus, he needed a foe big enough to warrant the death of this literary hero. Create a criminal so powerful and dangerous that Holmes would consider himself satisfied with his career if he could end Moriarty's, even if it cost him his life. For the uninitiated, it's important to note here that Moriarty was never mentioned before The Final Problem. Some might be surprised by that, given how in almost every version of the consulting criminal since, he's alluded to and foreshadowed heavily. An elusive figure lurking in the shadows, always pulling the strings but never being pulled into the light, until forced out when Holmes sees the wires. Usually a villain who is supposed to be the biggest deal a hero's ever faced, not being so much as mentioned until they show up, is a red flag. But in the brief time Moriarty is established, it comes with a very ominous presence to it. Most people are not aware of him, and those who are rightfully fear crossing his path. The Final Problem opens with Holmes sneaking into Watson's office, disheveled and skittish, avoiding being seen at all costs. Normally, Holmes is a very collected and domineering character, so seeing him fear for his life so openly is already disconcerting. He later reveals that he had survived no less than 3 attempts on his life that very day. The fact that he fears for his safety so much implies that we should too. As Holmes describes who Moriarty is, it's clear that despite inventing a profession where he deals with the most underhanded of individuals, this one was different. Holmes was admittedly intrigued by how Moriarty managed to pull off so much without getting caught, but he's also concerned, which he rarely ever was. But for the first few pages, Professor Moriarty is still a legend, a ghost, a name with an unspoken warning behind it, and nothing more. That's why he's dubbed the Napoleon of crime. He's a tactician, a general, someone who can come out victorious in a battle but sends others out to fight it. It's not until Holmes recounts a timely visitor he had that morning do we truly get to meet the man himself. This confrontation is absolutely incredible. Perhaps one of the best things Conan Doyle ever wrote. It's such a level playing field, with both men trying to gain the upper hand while also understanding that they're working with such an equal adversary that they can't. Holmes is thrown off slightly by Moriarty showing up at Baker Street, but he also prepares himself immediately, which Moriarty catches, Sherlock exposes, and they go on to have a little chat about where they both stand. While there is an obvious chill to their conversation, what also makes the scene stand find out is that there's a weird sense of respect between Holmes and Moriarty. The two don't often, if ever, cross paths with an intellectual equal. Both men pride themselves on being brilliant and invisible, having the upper hand on the other side without ever being noticed. But the frailty of genius is that it needs an audience. Now it's here, where the adversary can appreciate the effort of their pursuits, between two men who find everyday life dull and unstimulating, thus taking matters in their own hands to seek out more satisfying professions. But it's that very commonality that makes them despise each other. They work in an equal capacity and pride, but on opposite sides of the law, and the only thing that can complete their respective missions is destroying the other. It's strange, there's a sense of satisfaction and remorse when it comes to how they antagonize each other in these couple of pages. Moriarty points out that it pains him that he would have to resort to destroying such a formidable foe to put an end to his meddling, and when discussing Moriarty, Holmes says, and I quote, "My horror at his crime was lost in my admiration at his skill." But make no mistake, they want to end each other. Before the scene, Holmes has a lengthy monologue about how he'd consider his career complete if he could take down Moriarty and the criminal web he perches in the middle of. Meant to be an unsubtle foreshadowing of the events to come, I imagine. But this confrontation is so gripping because there's no clear advantage here for either side. Moriarty has a massive network underneath him, but Sherlock is very close to toppling the whole thing. He's just waiting for the right time. Holmes has a dominating presence practically at all times because he's usually the smartest man in the room, but what do you do when you face off against someone who can also claim that title? It's truly compelling. The dialogue is what really sells it too. They may be equals intellectually, but their back and forth makes it quite clear that neither will back down.
If you are clever enough to bring destruction on me, rest assured, I shall do as much for you.
They each know it.
Everything I have to say has already crossed your mind.
Probably my answer has crossed yours.
And they assure each other that if one of them meets their end, the other will too.
That if I were assured of the former eventuality, I would cheerfully accept the latter.
The somber thing about all this is that it does ultimately end in mutual destruction. Holmes and Watson attempt to flee the country while they wait for Moriarty to be arrested, but he follows them. The only way the chase ends is by hitting the finish line. Every man does. However, in retrospect, it reads as more triumphant than it must have over a century ago, because Holmes did indeed undercut him. Unlike the professor, he came back from the chasm of the Reichenbach Falls alive. I can only imagine how different Sherlock Holmes' legacy would be if he did indeed die in that face-off, but that kind of speculation isn't really the point of this video. Like the great detective here, we only care about the facts. And the fact is that one discussion Professor Moriarty has with Sherlock Holmes is his only scene in the final problem. Once he leaves, he doesn't get another piece of dialogue. True to his nature, he keeps to the shadows for the remainder of the story, a looming threat that's thought of and heard about, but never seen or heard from. Even the now famous battle at the Reichenbach Falls is not recounted as it's happening. It's pieced together by Watson jumping to conclusions after the fact based on what evidence was left behind the scene. That to me is what makes this such a villainous scene. Moriarty became one of the most famous and feared villains in all of fiction from just that one scene. Unless you count the Valley of Fear, but that's a whole other can of worms. It was written after the final problem, but takes place before it, and we're not going into it here. Plus, here's the thing. Apart from hardcore Sherlockians, no one remembers that story. It's never adapted. Everyone remembers this one. It's the ultimate case of leaving them wanting more. With an exchange that can be read through in a bathroom break, as a character who was purely a story device to kill Sherlock Holmes off for good, Moriarty is such a domineering, threatening, and powerful villain that he forged a legacy that would live on far, far, far longer than he did. Which was about, 12 pages at my count. It depends on which edition you have. His villainous status only increased as his character was put into film and television. Much more frequent appearances and elaborate foreshadowing were slowly introduced, and it all just felt so right. Such a spine-chilling presence will be felt even if it's not seen, and such a force of evil surely couldn't be knocked down with just one encounter. Heck, the Guy Ritchie movies imply he attempted to single-handedly start World War I just to profit off of it. That's how elaborate things got. Moriarty is such an essential part of Sherlock Holmes' history, despite, in the grand scheme of things, not playing much of a larger role than any other criminal he'd crossed paths with, that when the time came to expand those magazine stories into multimedia depictions, it only felt right to expand his role as well. Make him a threat that would match the one we were told about in a much more tangible way. And this goes far beyond adapting the character itself. I truly believe that we wouldn't have some of the most beloved and common villain archetypes we have in fiction today if Conan Doyle hadn't drawn up the blueprint that was Professor Moriarty so masterfully. The overbearing leaders of massive crime syndicates who have several layers of lackeys to go through before they're ever caught. The enemies who are equals to our heroes in almost every single way, more so than anyone else in the story. How villains can become dark reflections of our heroes if they'd made some different choices. Just the pure evil genius. How intelligence became a weapon in and of itself. It's not too hard to trace any of this back to this Victorian mathematician. Much like how Sherlock Holmes greatly contributed to the detective archetype in modern fiction, the criminal mastermind attributes a lot from Professor Moriarty, arguably the first diabolical mastermind. He's brilliant, cunning, has no redeeming qualities to the point that his movements are more reptilian than human, and the only reason he lost was because his adversary was just a little bit better. Creating a legacy that began with, but couldn't possibly be confined to, one villainous scene. Thanks for watching, everyone. Definitely know what you thought of this subject, I guess. It's tougher to ask what you think when it's not like a specific movie or something. Oh, hey, if you're a Sherlock Holmes fan too, let me know what your favorite version of Moriarty is. And before I get comments about this, yes, Ratigan counts. That's why the series is called Let's Talk About. Special thanks to Nando Movies for starting this prompt in the first place, and I apologize for being very, very, very late to the party. And of course, a very special thanks to my patrons who help support my content, including Chelsea Crandall, David L. Sproul, Hawk Hero, Jinx Productions, and Wait in the Wings. If you'd like to join these fine people in supporting my content while getting cool exclusive perks, you can check out my Patreon page at the link in the description, as well as my other social media if you'd like to check out any of those. Thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you guys next time.